So we are going to get into Joshua today, but before we get into Joshua, Joshua brings up some issues for people, and so I want us to be clear about what God's instructions were and why God gave those instructions to Joshua, because people will have trouble, and maybe you've dealt with this with friends who said, oh, I can't believe that God, told him to go in there and completely destroy the people in the land. So I tried to write some things up here to kind of help you in my own Bible at certain points where God is commanding this. I will write all of these different references up here because it helps me to remember, right? And it helps me when people have questions about it to go back and to be able to say, this is why, right? I wrote them all up here so that if you'd like to write them down, I know some of you like to come and just take a picture of it afterwards, and that's fine too. But these are all references that are God's instructions where he's explaining to them why this is necessary. And I thought it was important enough that we should take some time to think about it. So why did God command the destruction of the Amorites and Canaanites? It's the only time God ever does this, right? And what have we learned from the very beginning? That God is trying to teach us through the consequences right off the gate when he kicked them out of the garden. The wages of sin is death. The first, it was the death of an animal to cover Adam and Eve. And then when we get to the flood, the wages of sin is death. Their intentions were only evil continually, and God grieved that he had made man. And so we see the wages of sin is death. Sodom and Gomorrah, the sin had gotten so awful that God destroyed the city. So we've been seeing all along that God is really from the very beginning teaching his people that the wages of sin is death. It's what he told Adam and Eve, right? If you do this, if you rebel against me, if you do this, the wages of sin will be death. And we see that throughout the scriptures. So number one, the reason is because it was a punishment for their evil. God is not saying here that, hey, it's okay for one people to go in and destroy other people. He's not saying that. He's saying, I am doing this because their evil has reached such a situation. There are justifiable wars, we even would say, like when we went to war against Germany, and there are justifiable wars. God himself is declaring that this is justifiable because of their evil. He says that they've defiled the land. If you go to Leviticus 18, it says they had so defiled the land that the land is vomiting them out, right? But he also warns his people. He says, if you get in there and you do the same thing, it's going to vomit you out too. He's saying, listen, it was their evil that has led to this. And remember from Genesis 15:16, the reason they were 400 years in Egypt, he said he would not send Abraham. He told Abraham way back, 500 years before this, he said, I will not let you go in for 400 years. Your people will be enslaved for 400 years until the sin of the Amorites has reached its fullness. So God is a just God, right? He waited until the sin of the Amorites had reached its full measure. Now, what was the sin of the Amorites and the Canaanites in the land? Well, these references will tell you. They prostituted themselves to their gods. I thought that was an interesting way to say it. They prostituted themselves. God is going to use that with Israel when Israel begins to turn to idols. Now, why is it prostituting? It's because there is a true God and everyone knew it at one point. Remember, we talked about that. They all knew the true living God through Adam and Eve, through Noah, and it was a rejection of that knowledge that had led to them now prostituting themselves before gods who are not gods. They're idols. Number two, they had committed all kinds of sexual sins. And going back to Leviticus 18, he says, incest, adultery, homosexuality, he says all these things the people in the land have done. And that is why they have defiled the land. That is why the land is going to vomit them out, he says. And then we learn through 3 different passages in Scripture, in Leviticus 18:21, Deuteronomy 12, and Deuteronomy 18, that they were sacrificing their children to the god Moloch. They were burning their children in worship of this god Moloch. And then we learn in Deuteronomy 18 that they were practicing divination, sorcery, and witchcraft. And so he just says the evil of the Amorites and the Canaanites had reached such a point that now God was going to use the Israelites as judgment against them for the evil that they had done. The second thing is it's a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, right? God had promised him way back in Genesis 12:7 and Genesis 7:8, and then I put plus because he promises over and over again that God will give them this land. God chooses this land. And then we have to ask, well, why this land? We're going to look at that in a minute. But in Leviticus 25:23, very interesting, he says, I own the land, and you are just tenants of it, right? God is saying, I own this land, and even the Jews you're just my tenants. That's why you can't sell the land permanently, because ultimately I own this land. And it's very interesting if you go to Matthew 21, and we're not going to take time to look at it this morning, but if you go to Matthew 21:33 through 40, Jesus is going to use that same picture as a parable when he's talking to the Pharisees. He says, a landowner owned a vineyard, and he took great care of this vineyard. He built it up, and he did all that needed to be done to make it the most beautiful, flourishing vineyard it could be. And then he went away on a journey, the owner did, and he put the tenants in charge. Well, what did he call them? He says, you're my tenants. I own the land. And he says he put the tenants in charge, but then when harvest came, he sent his messengers to collect the harvest. And really what he's referring to is the prophets that God sent. And he says, you beat them, you killed them, you did not listen to them. So I said, I will send my son. And so anyway, that picture of God owning the land, there are tenants there. They're caring for the land, right? But God had an ultimate purpose. And here I need somebody's help to turn this around. Can you help me turn this around? Because I want to show you. Yeah, I want you to take it that way, but you have to lift. There you go. All right. Ta-da! We can do this. I couldn't flip it because I have this taped up there. Thanks, Ludon. So what I want you to see is that God, out of all the places on earth he could choose, he chose this one little piece of property, right? He stopped telling his people, I want you to take over the world. He was just establishing this one place in all of the world that would be his. And what did he want to accomplish with this place? He promised it first to Abraham. He said, Abraham, I'm going to give you this land in about 1900 BC. And then he let them go to Egypt, and they were in Egypt for 400 years, right? And I think that was for 2 reasons. One, it was to multiply, right? So when they went in, they were 70. Now they come out probably a couple million, right? Israelites. But number 2, we learned from Genesis 15:16, it was to wait until the sin of the people had reached that point where they now deserved the punishment that God was going to give them through the Israelites. Then miraculously, between 14 and 1500, God led his people out of Egypt through all these miracles, and then he leads them into the land. We're going to look at that today, the miracles he did to lead his people into this little land that he's going to give them, right? So he gives them this amazing victory, but he tells them, he says, listen, when you go into this land, I want this land to be a holy land, and I want this people, you as a people, to be a holy people. And that's before they got into the land. That's why he gave them the law. So that when they got into the land, they wouldn't defile the land like these people had. Instead, what they would do was they would establish a holy place for the worship of God. And why was it? Was it just for the Jews? No, it was so that they could become a kingdom of priests who would, by the beauty of their worship and the beauty of their principles that they were living by, that they would shine a light to the world. right? So he establishes that, but he warns them when he goes in. Remember, we looked at that last week. He said, listen, if you start doing all the same things that these people have done, I'm going to kick you out of the land. So he does. He's going to kick them out of the land. In 586 BC, he's going to send them to Babylon. He's going to let them be conquered because they break the covenant that they made with God, the Mosaic covenant. So he takes them into Babylon. But what does God never forget in the midst of all this interaction? What does he never forget? The Abrahamic covenant. He made a covenant, an unconditional, forever covenant with Abraham. So in 539, and again, it's a miracle. We're going to read about it, how 150 years before there's even a man named Cyrus, God predicts that a man named Cyrus is going to send them back into the land. And when Cyrus becomes the king, sure enough, he makes an edict and sends it back. The Bible's just a miracle book, gals. So again, he sends them back into the land. They are in the land then from early 500s BC until 70 AD. But here, before that happens, he sends them back into the land. They realize that they had broken the covenant. They become very concerned about not breaking the covenant again, which leads to the Pharisees and all the rule keeping, right, that happens. But then God sends his son, right? They haven't listened to the prophets. So now he's going to send his son. Where does he send his son? He sends him here to this land to tell them about God and what God's purposes were. And his son in this land is going to die for the sins, not just of the Jews, but for all of us, right? But because they rejected his son, what is he going to do? Jesus predicts it. He's going to kick them out of the land, but this time he's not going to send them to one country. He's going to send them all over the world, which is what we saw happen, right? The Jews were spread all over the world. But then, what won't he ever forget? The Abrahamic covenant. And he tells us in Ezekiel, I'm going to bring them back. It'll be like a resurrection from the dead. It'll be like dry bones coming back to life. So this country that wasn't a country for almost 2,000 years, and he says he will do it out of wrath. He will bring them back into the land out of wrath. Well, what wrath did he use to bring the Jews back into the land? The wrath of the Holocaust brings them back into the land in 1948, where the Jews are going to remain in the land until the tribulation. And in the tribulation, guess who's at the center of the tribulation? This land, Israel, right? The two witnesses that will be witnesses during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation are in Jerusalem, right? And when Jesus comes back again, guess where he's going to come? To Jerusalem. Zechariah is really clear. When he comes, he's going to touch down in Jerusalem. And when he comes, what is he going to do? He's going to set up the Messianic millennial kingdom. And where is he going to rule from? Jerusalem. So God chooses this one place, this one small piece of land, and he says, this is my land. And this, I want it to be a holy land, and it will be a holy land because Jesus is going to come and he's going to reign in it. He's going to finally, we're going to see what he intended all along. But he was giving the Israelites a chance to do that of their own volition, right? To see the goodness of God and to shine it to the world. And we're going to look at their history. You know, there are some high points, but there are a lot of really low points, right? Where they're not listening to God. But this was God's plan. And why was it God's plan? Why here? All I can say is it makes sense. It's like right in the middle, right? It's in the middle of 3 continents. It is where the trade routes, the main trade routes ran so that people were coming through, so that they would see. Remember how he says, so that people will see and they will say, oh my goodness, who is your God? That you've become such a wise and understanding people. And so God had a plan for this land. And so now we're going to see in Joshua, because of the sin of the people, he is telling his people, I am going to give you victory over these people, even though that they look stronger, even though they have fortified cities. It's going to be a miracle. You're going to see me work among you, just as you saw me work among you when I brought you out of Egypt. So anyway, all that to say, I just thought there needed to be a little preface before we dive into Joshua. So, yes, absolutely.
I was watching the video from last week, and you gave a very specific name to describe the return of the Jews to Israel. What is that word?
The Aliyah.
Aliyah.
Aliyah. A-L-I-Y-A-H. I-Y-Y-A-H. Aliyah. Aliyah.
Got it.
Yes.
Okay.
So the diaspora was the spreading out of the Jews, and the Aliyah is their return. It's their return to their land, and it's happening today. It's an amazing thing. I always say when you know the Bible, the news gets kind of exciting because you turn it on and you go, "Oh my goodness," you know. And the other thing is that knowing that God has told us, He's revealed the end of He hasn't revealed everything to us, right? But He's revealed enough that we really understand what the end of the story is. So that even when we see all these things happening in our world, we don't have to go crazy thinking that, well, everything's out of control. It's not out of control. God's got it in control. It is all heading towards where He said it was going to head, right? And we are watching it unfold. And the reason we can have confidence is we go through the Old Testament and you see how many ways God predicted and then fulfilled what was going to happen. That's what gives us confidence when we see His predictions for the future. We say, okay, if God said it, that's what's going to happen, because we can see all these ways through the Old Testament that He was prophesying. And in Isaiah, I love Isaiah, like 2 or 3 times he says, who else can do this but God? Who else can tell us? I can't even tell you for sure what's going to happen tomorrow. But the God who made us is able to tell us what is going to happen in the future, and He has. So anyway, all that said, we are going to dive now into Joshua. So let's review really quick where we've come so far. So the first era that we learned about was creation in Genesis 1 through 11. And the 4 main things of creation are creation, fall, flood, Tower of Babel. So Genesis 1 through 11 is creation. Then the second historical era is the patriarchs. And the patriarchs are Genesis 12 to the end, to chapter 50. And who are our 4 patriarchs? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Very good. So that's the patriarch era. Then these last many weeks we've been in which era? The Exodus era. That's the 3rd era. The Exodus era I always think is a little harder to remember. Do you remember what the 4 main things are? Deliverance. He delivers them out of Egypt, right? Then He gives them the law. So deliverance, law. Then they rebel at Kadesh Barnea, and then their punishment is 40 years of wandering. So those are the 4 main things to read about the Exodus era. It's Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are all the Exodus era. But now we're into a new era, and hopefully you read about that in your 30 days. So this next era, the 4th era, is called the Conquest, okay? 4 main things of the Conquest are the Jordan River, and we're going to look at that, the miraculous parting of the Jordan River, Jericho, the walls in Jericho falling, and conquest. They conquer the land, and the last thing is dominion. They begin to rule over the land that God has given them. Okay? So, with that in mind, let us look at Joshua chapter 1. And I always think, I've told you before, I think it's so gracious of the Lord when He calls you to do something that's extraordinarily difficult. He often just makes it so clear to the person that this is His call, this is what He wants them to do. So we saw that with Moses, right? That he appears in a burning bush. He presents himself in a way that's unforgettable, that Moses, through all the ups and downs and ins and outs, never doubted that this was what God wanted him to do. And He does the same for Joshua. Because you think about it, I mean, here's Joshua taking over for Moses, and he's been watching all these years, and what has he seen? What has Moses had to put up with for 40 years? The grumbling and complaining, the rebellion against his authority, and he's had all these different things, and now Joshua has been tasked with taking them into the land, which 40 years ago they wouldn't do, right? So you can imagine this is kind of an intimidating task. So right off the bat in Joshua chapter 1, we see God speaking to Joshua. Somebody read for us Joshua 1, verses 1 through 9.
Now it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and as far as the great sea towards the setting of the sun will be your territory. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, to be careful to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may have success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
Oh, I love these verses. And what's so wonderful about these verses is that God promises the same thing to us in the New Testament. He says, I will never leave you or forsake you. Jesus said to his disciples and those who would follow after, surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. So the same assurance that God is with Joshua is the same assurance that God gives to us. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And now he's telling him, be strong and courageous. So because you know I'm with you, two things. He says, number one, don't let the book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night. Think about it. Be pondering it. Be pondering why these things I'm telling you are good things. And then he says, and then be strong and courageous and do what I'm asking you to do. Go take that land, right? He says, be strong and courageous 3 times, right? He's telling him. Okay, don't be afraid. So he goes to the people in the camp. He tells them to get ready. In 3 days' time, God is going to do an amazing thing. And then listen to what they answer in verse 16. Then they answered to Joshua, whatever you have commanded us, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. And then I think this is a little bit funny. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. I'm like, I'm not sure how reassuring that was, but hey. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey your words, whatever you may command them will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. So the people say, we're with you, Joshua. You be strong and courageous. We're following you.
Was any of this generation part of the people that were enslaved, or are they all gone out?
No, the only ones are Joshua and Caleb. The only ones.
They don't have any memory of slavery. They're children.
Yes, some of them who were under 20 crossed the Red Sea, so there are people that were eyewitnesses to that, but most of these were probably born in the wilderness, right? And they've heard all the stories. They know how God saved them. They know why they're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years.
That is legitimate that they're saying, just as we obeyed you.
Oh, maybe so. Right, maybe so. And maybe their mothers and fathers got wise after that punishment, and they coached their children and taught their children, listen, we blew it. And let me just tell you that as a disciple maker, that's a good thing to be able to. We are not perfect people. And when you're a disciple maker, I've heard people say, well, I can't make disciples because I'm not there yet. And I'm like, well, when do you think you're going to get there, right? None of us are ever going to be perfect. But, and one of the valuable things is I had some older ladies who went through my first discipleship with me who were willing to admit where they had failed. And I learned so much from those ladies being willing to tell me, I blew it here, but you learned from me, right? And so sometimes we think we can only share with other people if we've been perfect. Well, we're reading here like nobody's perfect, right? Even the ones that we look to, Abraham and Moses, they failed. And so sometimes we can teach as strongly from our failures, right? Out of humility as we can from our successes and the amazing things that God has done. So anyway, hopefully, I hope some of those parents had learned and were teaching their children out of humility. Don't do what we did. When the time comes, you be ready to go. So I think it's in chapter 2, I think it's kind of funny that Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent in 2 spies. And I'm thinking the secretly, I mean, spies are secret, right? And when they're going someplace, they're not going to tell that they're spies. Who was the secret again? From the Israelites. And I'm thinking that he learned from the last, he was one of the 12 spies that went in and came back and gave a report to all of Israel. And where did that lead? Not to good things. So I think he chose these 2 spies carefully based on their character and their faith. But he says, hey, after you spy the land out, just come tell me, right? And so these spies go in, and as they're going, where do they end up staying? With Rahab at the house of this prostitute named Rahab. In what happens is that somebody finds out and tells that, hey, there's these spies that have come in and they're at Rahab's house. So what does Rahab do? She hides them on the roof underneath the flax, right? And but this is what she tells them. Look at chapter 2, verse 8. I want you to see this. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Do you remember that song that they sang after the Red Sea? They said, we'll be able to go take the land because everybody will be melting in fear. And sure enough, they are melting in fear. And she goes on, this is profound. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. How long ago was that? 40 years ago. And Rahab is saying, we all know about that. It has not been forgotten how God saved them from the powerhouse of Egypt by destroying the army in the Red Sea. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, who you completely destroyed. They were strong kings and they were completely destroyed. When we heard of that, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. What is she saying? She is saying, we know that God has given you this land. So this is something I want you, it's not the only time this is going to happen, where they find out that the people really do understand that God has brought them into the land and God is going to give them the land. And they realize that. And she realizes that their God isn't like the gods that she's been worshiping. She says, your God is the God of heaven and of earth. So I just want you to see this, because you know what? They did have a choice. Hearing and knowing and seeing all of this, they could have left, but they didn't. And most of the time they joined others to try and come against the Israelites. So anyway, she says, will you please, we know you're going to get the land. Will you spare the lives, in verse 13, of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, that you will save us from death? And the spies agree. They say, our lives for your lives. So she lets them down by a rope. She was on the city wall. She lets them down by a rope, and she tells them, and I don't know why this struck me this time. I thought that was really smart. She says, don't try and get back right away. Just go up to the hills and hide for 3 days so that they stop, looking and it settles down, and then go back. So they do that. But before they leave, they tell her, listen, we will do this for you. We will protect you and your family. But what do they have to do? They all have to be in that room with her, and she has to dangle that red rope so that they know that this is her place, right? So she agrees. She says, okay. So they left, they hid, they got back, and what did they tell? Somebody read chapter 2, verse 24. What did they tell Joshua?
They
said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us."
So, the spies come back and they say, you know what? God is going to do this for us. So early in the morning, Joshua gets up, gets the Israelites up, and I thought it was interesting in verse 3, giving the orders to the people. He says, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the priests who are Levites carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before." And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to put that. All I can think is that there's now no longer the cloud and the fire. It never tells us. It tells us when the manna stops, but it doesn't tell us when the cloud and the fire stops. And so he's saying, listen, when the priests go forward, then you'll know where to go and where we're heading. So he tells them, consecrate yourselves. He says in verse 7, the Lord says to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses." And so he has them go and he tells the priests that you're to carry the ark and you're to step into this overflowing Jordan River. It tells us that it was at the harvest and it was in the flood stages. In verse 15, but he tells the priests that they're to walk forward, and when they step in the river, God's going to do something amazing. But you think about that. He was asking them to take a step of faith, right? He says, go, and again, remember, these aren't the people who crossed the Red Sea for the most part. So this was a step of faith, and they did. They walked in. Now the Jordan, it says in verse 15 of chapter 3, the Jordan was at flood stage all during the harvest, yet as soon as the priest who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam. It's interesting that they even know where it was cut off, and it was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho, The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. So again, the same amazing miracle as he did with the Red Sea. Not only did he part water that shouldn't have parted, right? But he dried the ground so quickly that all these million people could move across it on dry ground. And then in the midst of that, he asked them to choose one from each tribe to go get a stone. And you remember how Moses keeps telling them, God keeps telling them through Moses, remember, remember, remember. So Joshua tells them, get these stones, put them on this side of the bank of the Jordan River, and this is going to be a memorial so that we never forget what God just did for us here, this amazing miracle that God did for us. And he says, and when your children ask you, what are these stones here for? You tell them. Don't forget to tell them about this amazing thing that God did for you. So they do that. I thought it was cute in at the end of verse 10 that he says that the people hurried over. I can imagine some of them were like, oh, how long is this going to hold, right? But God took them all the way across until they got the stones, and until the priests, it says as soon as they stepped out on the other side, it returned to flood stage. So a marvelous miracle.
Casting those stones exist today.
I wonder, because it says it will be a memorial forever, and there are many things in Israel that people can point to that are from the Bible, but I don't know about these stones. I don't know if they're still there.
A name of them, like if we were to Google it.
I don't know. You can just say, the 12 stones from Joshua 4, are they still there, right? It's amazing to me what you can Google. It's really...
And then I think,
Yeah.
you use the word stones, and of course you think, well, that would just stones. That, like if we're walking, we're going to pick something up. It's not going to be any bigger than this that we can lift. And yet, erosion stuff, the rain, it would have washed it. So I thought, well, then it must be
big
boulders. And to stack 12 of those.
Yeah.
But then how would they carry that?
Right, because he only says 12 men. Yeah, one man per stone. So it wasn't like, it was. So I don't know.
It's just kind of fun to think about.
Yeah. So anyway.
Think about God can do the impossible.
He can.
So if they're this big,
Yeah.
and he wants them to
Yeah.
remember, they're going to still be there.
Yeah, they could. So if anybody Googles that and finds out, just let us know. Anyway, so he does that amazing miracle again, showing them that he is with them, that he will do for them an amazing work. And so now somebody read chapter 5, verse 1.
And it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of the Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel, until we were passed over, that their heart melted, neither was their spirit in them anymore because of the children of Israel.
So you think about it, they were already aware of what God had done 40 years earlier, and now, oh my goodness, guess what God just did for them just the other day? How did this 2 million people get from that side of the Jordan to this side of the Jordan? And everybody knew an amazing miracle had taken place. At this point, the Lord instructs them to stop and get circumcised, because apparently during the 40 years of wandering, they hadn't been faithfully circumcising their sons. And so they stopped and they did that before they went in, because that is that sign of the covenant with the Lord. And then somebody pick up on verse 10 through 12 of chapter 5.
On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan.
So just think about that. For 40 years now, manna, no manna. For 40 years. And now they're in the land. They can eat the food of the land. And that miracle, that 40-year miracle stops, right? So just another amazing thing that God did. So now I think, again, here's God doing a wonderful thing for Joshua on the outset of his first battle. So somebody pick up with chapter 5, verse 13 through 15.
Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for this servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." Joshua did so.
Who is talking to Joshua? Jesus. And how do we know? I know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. How do we know? Who is the commander of the Lord's armies? Jesus. Revelation 19, 11 through 14. It is Jesus who is the commander of the Lord's army. The other reason that I know this is not just an angel is because what does Joshua do when he sees him? He falls down on his face and worships him. Now, if you've read the Bible, what does an angel do when you fall down and worship an angel? They tell you, get up, don't worship me, right? Every time you'll see that in the scriptures. If a human being falls down in front of an angel to worship him, the angel always says, "No, not me," right? Not this time, right? This time, not only does he receive the worship of Joshua, he says, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." What does that remind you of? Moses in Exodus 3, the burning bush. Take off your sandals because this place is holy. So God himself, in the form of Jesus, we call this a theophany. That's an appearance of God in a living form, which we believe that's Jesus because God himself is spirit, right? But here is this appearance of Jesus to Joshua. And Joshua is the name for Jesus in Hebrew, right? Jesus and Joshua are the same. It means he who saves, right? So anyway, I just think it's pretty cool. Joshua and Jesus meet. And Jesus tells him, take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. And then he proceeds in 6:2 to tell Joshua, Then the Lord says to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men." Now he's going to propose the most interesting battle plan ever. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days, and have the priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout, and then the wall of the city will collapse and the people will go up, every man straight in. So what is he requiring of them? Faith. Right? I mean, this battle plan doesn't make any sense from a human perspective, right? I mean, yeah, okay, so Joshua, this is how you're going to show them that's what, you're going to march around the city, right?
And disregard the Sabbath.
Oh, I didn't catch that. Yeah, for 6 days and then on the 7th. That's interesting. I thought about that, Ladon. That's interesting. So anyway, they do this, and then on the 7th day, so it took faith. And I'm sure some of his warriors were like, "We're doing what? Again?" Right?
Faith and obedience.
Obedience, right? And that's what God was saying. That's what God asked us. He says, you won't always understand the whys of what I'm asking you to do, but will you just do it because I'm telling you to, and trust that I have your best at heart, right? And so they follow through, they march around, they do that for 6 days, and I am quite sure that the people, remember, they were kind of afraid to begin with. And at first, I don't know, maybe some of them mocked, but I'm sure that by the 7th day, they're going, "Oh my goodness, what is going on here?" And we're talking a lot of people, right? So this is huge, maybe they encircled them for a while, right? Because there's so many Israelites. So anyway, by faith, they do what God said, and guess what? On the 7th time around, on that 7th day, they blow the trumpets, they give a great shout, and what happens? The walls, the big walls of Jericho just come tumbling down. So, yeah, I know, because you always think of the song, right? So they go in and they are able to completely take Jericho. And again, it's just this amazing miracle. But I want you to see that before they went in, in chapter 6, verse 18, he says, "But keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them." Verse 19, "All the silver and gold, the articles of bronze and irons are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury." So clear instructions before they went in. The devoted things are not things that you should keep. They need to be devoted to the Lord. So when God gives them this victory, they go in. Rahab is saved, she and her family. And Rahab Rahab the prostitute comes to live with the Israelites. And the fascinating thing, and I love this about God's story, is Rahab, this Gentile prostitute, becomes part of the lineage of Jesus. Matthew 1:5, I have it written right next. Matthew 1:5, if you go to Matthew 1:5, Rahab is in the lineage of Jesus. And not only is she in the lineage of Jesus, she is King David's great-great-grandmother. I love how redeeming God is, right? And this is another thing that we need to remember, is that though God will bring judgment upon nations, we see that all through Scripture. He does bring judgment upon nations for their wickedness. He also sees individuals, always, always. So you think about that even in terms of our country. God might have to punish us for the wicked ways that we're going, right? But he always also sees the individuals. He knows which ones are standing up for him. And so he saves Rahab. And I always think, this is just my own little thought, is that she ends up marrying a guy named Salmon, S-A-L-M-O-N. We find that out from Matthew 1:5 and from Ruth 4:21. And I always wonder, was he one of the 2 spies? I just always wonder about that. Wouldn't that make a great story, right? She hid them, and then anyway, I have no idea. The Bible doesn't tell us. But I just think it's very redeeming to see how God, even though he's telling them you have to destroy these people, he sees Rahab. He sees that Rahab has a heart for her. And you know what? That's why he keeps telling them that how they're to treat the aliens, and to remember that they also were aliens. Anybody could join them. Like the Egyptians, I'm sure there were Egyptians that joined them when they left Egypt. if they were willing to come under the authority of God and come into with them the worship of the one true God. Yeah, May?
I just recently saw the movie Chariots of Fire,
Mm.
and it quoted now, he who honors God honors man.
Yeah,
And Rahab did that.
yeah, yeah.
She honored God.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did, and God honored her in the midst of that. So anyway, we'll see her name come up again later on, but I think that's interesting. And then,
Just to say real quick,
yeah.
Francine Rivers wrote a
Did
book
she write one about that?
Rahab, of how it could have been.
Did she put her marrying one of the spies? Oh, see, I'm not the only one that thinks that. So anyway, in Joshua 6, at the end of Joshua 6, Joshua puts a curse on the one who rebuilds Joshua. He says, or Jericho. Whoever undertakes to rebuild the city of Jericho, it will be at the cost of his firstborn son will he lay its foundations, and at the cost of his youngest will he set up its gates. And the reason I wanted to point that out is in 1 Kings 16:34, that's exactly what happens. Somebody undertakes to rebuild Jericho, loses both his firstborn and his lastborn son because of this curse. So anyway, I just wanted you to see that. So then in chapter 7, okay, and I just want to show you this on the map, okay? So they have come up through here. They have defeated the people all on this side. So they've captured this part of the land, right? This is the 2.5 tribes who said, hey, can we stay here? We'll go to battle with you, but they're going to live here. And now they crossed over right here, and they established the monument at Gilgal. That's where they crossed over. And then they're coming down and attacking Jericho. Well, after they attack Jericho, there's this little town called Ai up here. And they actually go scout it out, and they come back and tell Joshua, they said, oh, Ai is not a big deal. So we can just send, a few thousand of our men, and that should be enough. And so they go and attack Ai, and what happens?
Get defeated.
They get totally defeated. They lose 36 men in a battle. And they come back, and everybody's horrified. And Joshua tears his clothes, which is a sign of deep grief. And he falls face down in chapter 7, verse 6, on the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. And then he says in verse 8, O Lord, what can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of this country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your great name? So he's concerned, right? Because he says, listen, if this little town of Ai defeated us, what's going to happen? The word's going to get around that, hey, it's easy to defeat these Israelites. So he has reason to be concerned. So the Lord says to him, stand up, verse 10, what are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen it and have hidden it. I always think, boy, this would have been, if I was Achan, he calls out the 12, and then God shows him which of the 12 tribes, and then he calls out the tribe and clans, and he shows him which of the clans. If you're Achan, don't you think, at first you're probably thinking, and then it's getting narrower and narrower, and suddenly you think, because God knows, right? And Achan had stolen gold and other things and had hidden it in his tent, and that is why they were defeated. And so again, we see the severe punishment of stoning, but you think again, here God had been very clear with them, do not take the devoted things. If Achan had gone away with it, and word got out that, oh, Achan did it, no problem, right? What was going to happen? Suddenly everybody, right? Because they're going to be taking all these different cities, and suddenly everybody's going to be out for their own. And so Achan is killed along with his family. He says, you were responsible for the deaths of 36 of our men, right? It was because you did this thing that we were defeated at Ai. So then we get to chapter 8, and it's very fascinating because my husband told me that this is still in the military strategy books today, and it's from way back here in Joshua chapter 8. So Ai, he gets defeated, right, by Ai. So he knows God is going to give us victory. We've taken care of the sin. So So now God's going to give us victory. So what Joshua does is he splits up into 2 groups, and he sends his men around. He sends one group around the back, secretly goes around the back. And then he, with his men, go up the front. And when the people from Ai come out to attack, they pretend like they're being routed like they were before, and they go running. And so the men of Ai come running after them, and as all the army of Ai comes out to meet them, the other part of his army is in the back, and they come and they take over the city. And when the people of Ai look back and they see smoke coming up from their city, and then Joshua and his men turn around, and now they're sandwiched, right? They've got them exactly where they want them. So anyway, all that to say, it's an amazing strategy that worked for Joshua, and people are still learning about today in military schools. So, and I think God somebody asked last night, did the Lord tell him what to do? And it doesn't say anywhere that the Lord gave him that instruction. I think the Lord is just giving Joshua wisdom about how to go about this.
So commentary said he was a military genius.
Yeah.
The Lord gifted him.
Right, he totally had. If God's going to give you a job, he's going to gift you to do it, right? So then in chapter 8, verse 30, Joshua fulfills a promise that they made back in Deuteronomy 27, that through Moses, the Lord had told them that when you get into the land, you're to make these stones with carved on them the commandments, so that everybody can see. And so they do take these stones and they carve in the commandments, and then they make this recommitment to the Lord. In verse 34, it says that Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the cursings, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and the children and the aliens who lived among them, those who had chosen to follow Yahweh, the God of Israel, and were among them. So he reminds them of their commitment. So now in chapter 9, all the kings west of the Jordan heard about these things, and they come together. They unite in verse 2 to make war against Joshua and Israel. But here's the deal. While they're coming to make war, there's this little town of Gibeon that's right here. So I want you to say, here's Jericho, here's Ai, and here's Gibeon. And the Gibeonites have heard everything just like Rahab had heard. And they know what God is going to do. So what do? They come up with their own strategy. What do?
We're really hungry.
Yes! They come with moldy bread and their sandals all worn out and their clothes in tatters, and they said, we have come from far away, but we've heard that God is with you, and so we want to make a peace treaty. Now, if you go back to Deuteronomy, that's exactly what God said. He said, I am only telling you to take this bit of land here, that's all. He says, anybody outside of that, if they come to you and they want to make a peace treaty, absolutely, you make a peace treaty with them. So these people, the Gibeonites, come saying, we have come from far away, will you make a peace treaty with us? And Joshua, what does it say that he did or didn't do?
He didn't consult the Lord first.
He didn't consult the Lord. So chapter 9, verse 14, the men of Israel sampled their provisions, this moldy bread, but they did not inquire of the Lord. So then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. So they made an oath that they would not attack them, that they would make a peace treaty, and they did not figure out until afterwards that Gibeon was right there, right there in the land. And so Joshua summons them in verse 22 and says, why did you deceive us by saying we live a long way from you? Well, actually, you live near us. You are now under a curse, he said. You will never cease to serve as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of God. And this is how they answered. They answered Joshua and said, your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and to wipe out all of its inhabitants before you. Again, I just want you to see, the inhabitants know what is happening, right? They're not surprised. They know, they've heard. So they said, "We feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do to us whatever seems good and right." So Joshua stays true to his oath. And so what's interesting then when we get to chapter 10, and I probably slaughter all these names. You guys, I always pronounce things with confidence, but it's not because I know how to pronounce them. It's just because I just guess, right? So now Adoni-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it. I'm in chapter 10, verse 1. And doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon, now listen to this, this is interesting. The people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and were living near them. So this Adoni-Zedek, he and his people were very much alarmed at this because Gibeon was an important city, like one of the royal cities, and it was larger than Ai, and its men were good fighters. So this is what's interesting, right? It wasn't that Gibeon is just this weak little small little place and they're afraid. It's that Gibeon is a significant city in the region with known to have good fighting men, and this city decides, no, we don't want to go up against the Jews, right? We don't want to go up against the Israelites. So they come to make peace, and that is alarming them. As much as anything else, that is alarming them. So he says, he gets these kings together, and he doesn't say, okay, let's go and attack the Israelites. He gets these kings together, and he says, let's go attack Gibeon. Let's show them. You know, nobody needs to make a peace treaty with them. So anyway, these kings, there are 5 kings of the Amorites. There's that Amorite, again, that we learned about in Genesis 15:16. But anyway, they come up against the Gibeonites in verse 6. The Gibeonites send word to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, "Do not abandon your servants. Come to us and quickly and save us." So Joshua, and again, this is a strategy that we'll find out again gets used at different times in the Civil War. One of the great battles was fought by this. What he does is he does in verse 9 an all-night march. So he marches through the night to get to, and he takes them by surprise. They're coming up, they're thinking, you know, the Israelites are over here in Gilgal. The Israelites are here. They had gathered their troops. They're coming here to attack Gibeon. They march all night so that they take these kings that have gathered together by surprise, and they defeat these kings and are able to overcome them. So anyway, that's another... and it says in verse 11, as these kings fled before Israel on the road down from Beth-horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them from the sky, and more of them died from the hailstones than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. And this is something I want you to know. I'll read you some stuff when we get to 1948 and when the nation of Israel was established. God has fought for Israel in so many miraculous, incredible ways. In the future, we know he's going to fight for Israel in miraculous and incredible ways. And that's all to say, God is trying to show us that the only reason Israel is here is because I have chosen them, right? And I have my hand on them, even with all their disobedience, even with all the things that they have done. They are my people, and I will fulfill my covenant with them. It's an amazing thing. So anyway, God fights for them. And the other amazing thing, somebody read the other amazing thing that happens, verse 12 to 14.
On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon."
That sounds good.
So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on the enemies. As it is written in the book of Jasper, the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since the day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord is fighting for Israel.
Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. One of these days, I'm just going to sit down and write down all the miraculous things that God did to fight on behalf of the Israelites. So many times he tells them, just trust the Lord. And you find that when we're going to see this in the Kings, when they are at their most vulnerable, if they will just turn to the Lord rescues them in so many miraculous, amazing ways. It's really quite incredible. So he does that for them here.
This is one of the things that people who denounce the Bible say, well, it can't be true because the world is just spinning.
Yeah.
So I've researched this a little bit.
Yeah.
If you go back, China, who was excellent at record keeping, China, who's, has nothing to do with anything else, right?
Yeah.
Chinese records record this day that the sun stopped in the sky. And there's theory that, and it's just theory, of course, but there's theory that a large comet came by just close enough to the Earth's rotational and atmosphere that it was large enough that it slowed the rotation of the Earth just long enough to stop it and then restarted it again as it flew through. So there's theory that.
Here's the thing about I think about miracles, because I think we try and look for human explanations for the miracles as they're recorded in scriptures. But here's the thing I was telling him last night. If God, and I think C.S. Lewis wrote a book about miracles because people stumble over that. They said, how could this possibly happen? But think about it. If there's a God who created this whole universe, right? All of the laws of the universe were made by who? God. And just like a man can create a machine like a car and then make adjustments where he wants to because he created it and he knows what he can do within that system, God can do things that we cannot do, that we cannot explain. But he created the system, so could God miraculously interfere in the system and the way he created things to work? Yes, he can. That's what happened with the Red Sea, right? The rivers don't just stop flowing and pile up in dry ground. That just doesn't happen. But the God who created it all is fully capable of intervening in his own creation for the purpose of revealing himself to men. And one of the interesting things, I don't think 30 Days still has this chapter, but long ago, I started using 30 Days ancient, like 30 years ago. But they used to have a chapter in there that was very eye-opening for me. Because you think, well, why don't we see God doing these things today? Right? Why don't we see these kind of miracles today? And I believe that God still does miracles. But when you think about it, he says there were only 3 periods of the Bible when there were these kind of miracles. Astounding, defying natural elements miracles. The first time was with Moses, right? And all of the miracles he did to deliver his people out of Israel. And then he also does it for Joshua, the one who's stepping in on Moses' behalf. What is he showing them? That not only was I with Moses, but now I am with Joshua, and I will do what I committed to do, right? So that's the first period of these amazing, astounding miracles. But then when they're in the kingdom era, we're going to read about that. They had a lot of ups and downs, a lot of downs, right? Where they're not following God, where they're worshiping idols. And at a point in that time of history, God sends 2 prophets. Now, most prophets only spoke the words of God to the people, but these 2 prophets did amazing, miraculous things. Does anybody know who they are? Elijah. And then not only Elijah did these amazing, miraculous things, but then Elisha. And why would what is God trying to say when he does these miraculous things? He's saying, this is me. This is the God of the universe telling you this. And I think at that point, it was the God of the universe warning his people, Israel, you're breaking the covenant. And I'm sending my prophets to tell you, if you don't stop, if you don't repent and turn around, that the very thing I told you was going to happen is going to happen. Listen to them. I am working in and through them. And then the third time of astounding miracles was when? Jesus. And then not only Jesus, I just think it's interesting that and then also who else? His disciples. After Jesus is resurrected, his disciples are enabled to do these amazing, astounding miracles that nobody can explain outside of God is doing this, right? And so at these 3 critical times in history when God was revealing something very important He does these miracles. Now, somebody brought it up last night, we're going to see some of that in Revelation too. Yes, we are, in the end times. We're going to see, but some of those will be deceitful miracles, which is why we need to understand Deuteronomy 13 and 18, right? That there's a test for, whether somebody is from God or not. So anyway, all that to say, I thought that was a fascinating insight that I had never thought of. So all this I want to say is that what they did was, they came up this way, they defeated these people, then they crossed over here at Gilgal, and then they fought all the people in the south. And they took the south, but it's very interesting because it will tell us that they didn't defeat the people of Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. So these people continue to be a problem for them, and when we get to the kings and to the judges, you'll see that they're often fighting the Philistines. Well, it's because they left this group of Philistines that were still there in the southern part of the kingdom, that they keep having to deal with them later on in their history, we'll see. But he first goes south and he defeats the south, and then he goes north and they defeat the cities and the territories in the north.
Is that the same area as Gaza today?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it is, yeah. Yeah, it is.
So today, we're still dealing with it.
That's true. We're still dealing with that same. Yeah, that's it. That's where the Gaza Strip is.
And I read somewhere that God has never given Israel Gaza.
He hasn't. Well, he hasn't given them the full territory. I don't think they will have the full territory until Jesus comes.
Right.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
millennium.
The millennial kingdom. Yeah. So anyway, so now it talks about, I'm trying to think if there's anything important in the next few chapters. He conquers more kings. In chapter 12, I think it's a list person made this list. The king of Jericho won. The king of Ai won. I just think it's interesting the way they listed at the end. 31 kings in all are defeated. And then in 13, we see that Joshua is old. He's very advanced in years. And the Lord said to him, "You're old. And there are still large areas to be taken over," right? They haven't defeated everybody. So anyway, he tells them the lands that remain. But at this point, it seems like they stopped doing their major battles, which is interesting because somebody asked me last night, well, was that Joshua's fault? What happens here is now they're going to divide the land. And he's going to tell them, yes, there are still people in your land that need to be defeated, but you can defeat them, right? God is with you, you can defeat them. Was that true? Yes, it was. But would it be harder? Think about this. If you were an Israelite and you were with 600,000 fighting men going up against these different towns, or you were in your tribe, which maybe had 20,000 or 30,000 or whatever, would you have the same confidence that you had when you had all the backup, right? So I think it became more difficult. I'm not saying Joshua did anything wrong here. There's no indication that he did. But I think once they divided up the land, which they did before every territory was conquered, it got harder and harder to conquer those smaller territories that hadn't been defeated. But I love in chapter 14 that Caleb steps up and he says, in verse 7, he says, "I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my brothers who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly." So verse 10, "Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day." And Anakites were there, and Anakites were known to be like giants, right? And here is Caleb saying, "I'm 85, but no problem." I just think what a man of faith, right? He believed, and I think through that it was showing that yes, you can, even though we're dividing up in our tribes now, you can take this. Like God will give you the land if you will just have the faith to go and take it, right? And so Caleb at 85 goes and takes that land in Hebron, which is interesting. That's later on where David will reign for a period of years before he becomes king of all Israel. But anyway, all that to say, when we get to chapter 15, it says that Caleb won the land, but there was this one part that he was having trouble with. And so in verse 16, Caleb says, I will give my daughter Aksah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Zephyr. And I'm sure there's some romantic thing here too, because I'm sure Othniel was interested in taking it for more than just the victory. So Othniel, son of Kenaz, is Caleb's brother. So these were cousins, right? And cousins weren't, said that the cousins couldn't marry. It doesn't say that in the law. So Othniel took the land, so Caleb gave Aksah to Othniel. And the reason I wanted you to see that in verse 17 is that Othniel, when we get to Judges, which is this next week, is the first judge of Israel. This Othniel, that is would be Caleb's nephew, is the first judge of Israel. What's that?
And son-in-law.
Yes, right. His nephew and son-in-law. So anyway, and then it's interesting that she gets off and she asks him for spring. The daughter does, and I just think, again, that's one of those little details that, is it important for the overall story? No, but it's just happened, right? That was part of the story. And I think at the end of 15 in verse 63, this is just interesting. Judah could not dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. So to this day, the Jebusites lived there with the people of Judah. Now, to this day was at the time of the writing of this, right? The Jebusites don't get completely defeated until David frees up Jerusalem. So anyway, but then there's several that said, and they didn't completely, dislodge them from here, and they didn't completely dislodge them from there. So you're starting to get it, and it's going to reiterate in Judges that there were several places still that the people had not defeated. And so it's going to cause a problem. Remember, he told them, he says, listen, I'm telling you, when you go in, you need to completely defeat them. He says, you need to not make a treaty with them, because I do not want you to intermarry. Because if you intermarry, you will start worshiping their gods. And if you start worshiping their gods, you'll start doing all these sexual, sins, and you will get pulled into idolatry, into sorcery, into witchcraft, he says. So do not do that, right? And he says, if you don't take all this territory that I'm giving you, he says, they will become a thorn in your side and barbs in your eyes. They will become a problem for you. And we're going to see that indeed that is what happens.
Is that kind of the beginning of their disobedience?
I would say yes. Yeah. And he says, he tells them, because they come and they complain, they say, at one point, in the end of 17, the people of Manasseh say, the hill country is not enough for us, we're too many. And Joshua said, you're numerous and very powerful. Verse 17, you will not have only one allotment, but the forested hill country as well. Clear it and its farthest limits, and it will be yours. Though the Canaanites have iron chariots, and though they are strong, you can drive them out. So yes, as he's dividing the land and telling them to go, he's saying, listen, just as God has been with us, he will be with you. Now it's your responsibility to drive out in your own territories as they're dividing up the territories. It's your responsibility to drive them out. So yes, that was the beginning of their disobedience, was to not drive them completely out. And now it's going to be a problem for them. And we saw that, on the other side of the board, one of the references I had was Numbers 25, 1 through 3, because that just illustrates that's at Peor, where that's how the Canaanites were going to defeat them. They sent their women over in order that they would indulge in sexual immorality and idolatry. And so it's a strategy that succeeds against God's people. And he's saying, if you don't do this, it will be a problem for you. So then in chapter 18, the whole assembly of the Israelites gathers at Shiloh, and here they set up the tent of meeting. So I just wanted you to see this Here's Shiloh, which is really like right in the middle, right, of everything. And this is where they will originally set up the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. So for the first many years, this will be the place where if they're to bring offerings and sacrifices, and 3 times a year the Jews are to come, it will be to Shiloh at first until King David moves it down to Jerusalem and builds the temple in Jerusalem. So I just wanted you to see that. So he divides it up and he casts lots, and I think, oh my goodness, I just wonder, were there big arguments about this, or did they just say, okay, because here, if you want to come up and look, this is how they divided the land. You look at this is Judah, all this pink here. Manasseh's got all this yellow, and then you've got Benjamin here's got this little bitty thing, and, so some of it looks like, if you're just looking on the map, and I have no idea what kind of land it is, it looks like some people got a lot more than other people, right? And so I can just imagine, the heated maybe conversations that took place. So the scriptures doesn't say that, but I think it was good that God had instructed them not to covet, right? Don't covet your neighbor's land. And even that, you think, even when they had scoped out their territory for their tribe, then who gets what houses, right? They're moving into this land that already has houses and vineyards. Who gets to decide who gets that really nice house on the corner with the, planted vineyards? I think there must have been a little, anyway, it doesn't say, but I think there must, just knowing human nature, there were probably some little tiffs over that. So anyway, they separate, they actually do it, they cast lots, they kind of separate out the regions, and then they cast lots, and it seems like they all agreed that, okay, wherever the lots fell, we'll accept that territory. So then it goes on. We're not going to go over all the different territories and all the different cities. That's a little much. We're going to skip to 22. And it says in 22 that Joshua then gives the Reubenites and Gadites and the half tribe of Manasseh, who, remember, live on the other side. And he says, okay, you guys have fulfilled your promise. You helped us capture the territory. Now you can go home. So they're heading out, but what did they do as they're heading out?
Put some stones.
They built an altar, actually a replica of the altar that was at the tabernacle. So they built this replica altar and they put it right by the Jordan River, and the others get wind of it, and what do they think?
They were worshiping idols.
They're like, oh my goodness, we're just now getting in the land and already they're disobeying God. They're building an altar because God said only one altar, and this is the only place you're to sacrifice. And here they've built an altar. And so they get wind of it, and so they get all their troops together. They're like, oh my goodness, we have to take care of this like right away. So they get all their troops together and go and confront them. Can you imagine? They're standing there and all these people ride up all, with their, armor and their swords and their spears. And when Reuben and Gad and verse 21, when the half tribe of Manasseh heard about all this, and they replied to them, they said, the mighty one, God the Lord, the mighty one, God the Lord, he knows. Let Israel know. If this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord and to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings, or to sacrifice fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord himself call us to account. No, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you. You have no share in the Lord, so your descendants might cause us to stop fearing the Lord. So what were they afraid of?
That their kids would forget.
That their kids would forget, or that the people on the other side of the Jordan would forget that we're all one, right? That because of the Jordan River being this boundary, that they would forget that they are Israelites as well, and that they have a right to come and to worship and to be part of the Israelites. So they said that is why we built it. On the contrary, verse 27, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifice, and fellowship offerings. Then in the future, your descendants will not be able to say to ours, you have no share in the Lord. And we said, if they ever say this to us or to our descendants, we will answer, look at the replica of the Lord's altar, which our fathers built, not for burnt offerings or sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you. So they actually built it. It was a huge misunderstanding, right? It could have been a disaster. But they built it to remind everybody that they also were part of Israel. So anyway, disaster averted. And then Joshua calls them all together, and he reminds them of everything that the Lord has done. So somebody pick up in chapter 23 and read verses 1 through 5.
After a long time had passed and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, and said to them, I am very old. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for our sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations and that remain, the nations I conquered between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. The Lord your God himself will push them out for your sake. He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of their land as the Lord your God promised you.
So he's saying you will have success. You just need to finish. He says, we've conquered so much, now you need to finish it off. So he says, be strong and be careful, verse 6, to obey all that's written in the book of the law. 7, do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods and swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God. So he's reminding them, and then he warns them again in verse 12. But if you turn away and ally yourself with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your back, thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. So again, just a very stern, firm reminder of what the God has said. And then he reviews with them their history about the promise that God made to Abraham, about their great deliverance through Moses and Aaron, verse 5. This is the verse I was looking for you, Mona. It says in verse 9, we were just talking about Balaam and how it was probably more of his intentions that the Lord was after. When Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you, but I would not listen to Balaam, right? So Balaam was wanting to curse, but he blessed you again and again. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. And then he reviews that now I'm giving you a land that you did not build, cities that you did not build, a land that you did not toil on. So now look at this. This is amazing to me. Verse 14, what does he tell them? It's kind of like Moses' last words to the Israelites. These are Joshua's last words as he gathers the Israelites.
Just 14?
Just verse 14.
Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord.
Put away the gods your fathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. What does that tell you? That after all this time, and after all that they've seen of the glory of God, after the punishments for when they did the calf, the golden calf, they are still carrying idols with them from Egypt that they haven't destroyed. And Joshua knows this. So he says, listen, you need to commit yourself to serve the Lord, to fear him only, and get rid of those gods that you still have from Egypt. And then, this is a famous verse. You'll see this on a lot of plaques. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river back in Egypt, or the gods of the Amorites, the ones we just defeated, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua takes a stand. So the people answer and say, far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us out and our fathers up from Egypt, from the land of slavery, and performed these great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God. Which sounds wonderful, except what did they not commit to doing? They say nothing about getting rid of the idols that they still have.
So Kathy, what was it about these idols that so attracted them?
Well, it's hard for
It's
us.
like a rock sitting there.
Right,
You know?
and it's hard for us to know. And then Isaiah has some great passages about idols. You bow down to this. You take a piece of wood and you cut it in half you burn, and the other half you make into this idol that you bow down. And so he says it makes no sense, right? And it certainly makes.
Especially after seeing a true living God that's a man of action. I mean,
Yes.
you need to put
Right.
I mean, things
Right, that they're
happen.
interacting with.
What did that rock do?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
didn't do anything.
Yeah,
It
but
just
again,
sat
you
there.
see, I think Satan knows that we have this in us to worship, to know that there has to be something more than us. And Satan has been from the beginning of time trying to deceive us into worshiping something, anything, and now it's evolution, rather than the true and living God. So Satan keeps presenting all these, so this God is the one who will give us a good harvest, and they would do whatever they could to appease that God, and this God is the God of sexuality. And so they were just making up their own gods, but this is what I think we do today. And here I'll go off on my little Kathy tangent here, right? So we think it's kind of foolish to us. We can't imagine somebody bowing down before an idol, right? A statue but what we've done today is we've created God in our own image,
Yes.
right? So even though we're not bowing down to a form of something, how many even Christians do you know that are saying, well, I don't believe this about God, but I believe this about God. And they're creating a God who they like. Right? A God who suits them and who suits what they want to do, right? And who will approve of what they want to do. And instead of coming to the God who is and saying, who are you and what is it that you want of us? They are creating their own God that they feel comfortable with, and that is who they are worshiping. And I think that is certainly as wrong as what these people are doing as they worship these different idols. I just think Satan has...
We've got stuff in our culture like astrology and
Sure.
the rocks.
Well,
they do
and
things
it's very interesting to me
Yeah.
that even some of the old things are picking up, like the worship of the Mother Earth, right?
Yeah.
It's very fascinating, like that we're bound to worship something, and if you take God away, people will replace it with other things.
The New Age.
The New Age movement, absolutely, yeah.
When you watch the old Ten Commandments and the Israelites are in the desert with the golden calf rock, and it looks ridiculous because the women are slinging their hair. What are they doing to that calf? But then you think, other than being that image, we're just replacing it with another golden, and they're all
Yes.
golden calves.
Yes. Yeah.
Things that we put before God.
Yeah.
But
So, yeah.
Didn't Satan in the garden,
Yeah,
when he tempted Eve, it was like, look at this.
yeah.
Look how pretty this
Yeah.
is, and it's good. So it's the eye.
Oh, and that certainly is true, which is why he warns
Car,
them.
the pretty house, the pretty clothes.
But that's why he warns them. He says, do not be tempted to take these idols for their gold and their silver. He says, don't. He said, you need to just destroy them. So he knew that would be a temptation also for the Israelites. So anyway, I just think then Joshua says to the people in verse 19, you are not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He's a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he's been so good to you. But the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. Joshua says, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen to serve the Lord. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, said Joshua, Throw away the foreign gods that are among you and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. And how fascinating. The people say, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him, but they do not commit to throwing away the foreign gods. Isn't that interesting? Interesting. So Joshua reviews the covenant with the people. It says in verse 31 that Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. And, verse 32, Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt and had carried for all 40 years as they wandered in the desert, finally was buried at Shechem. So anyway, just interesting things to end it. But here's something I just want to leave you with as we think about this, because I do think, as we looked last week, that part of what's going on here is that what God's interactions with Israel are a parable to us, something that we're to learn from, right? And we talked about last week how we also, just like the Israelites had an unconditional covenant and a conditional part, we also have this unconditional covenant that God has done, just like what he did for the Israelites. He did this mighty work. They didn't have to do anything. He did the 10 plagues. He parted the Red Sea, right? He did all the heavy work for them. All they had to do was follow him, right? And so in that same way, I think that's what's happened with us, is that Jesus came down and he did all the heavy lifting for us. We were in this predicament. Our sin had left us separated from God. We were in this predicament, and we couldn't free ourselves from that predicament. And so Jesus comes down. He pays for our sin and makes this unconditional covenant. And all we have to do is believe him. We don't have to do anything except just believe that what he did for us was real. And then we become a new creature in Jesus, right? Forgiven. All of our sins are forgiven, past, present, and future, right? But then think about this. Now what does he want us to do? We talked about this last week. Does he just want us to sit there and say, oh, yay, now I'm forgiven. Now I can live my life however I want to? No. He wants us to enter into what he calls the abundant life. And the abundant life only comes as we start obeying him, listening to what Jesus is telling us and doing what he says. So there are many Christians today who are just like, they trust in Jesus and then they wander in the wilderness the rest of their life, right? Because they believed him enough to get free, but then they won't follow him to take possession of the land, right? And I think that happens with us, but I picture it as our hearts, like our hearts when we come to Jesus. And I don't know, maybe some of the testimonies in here, I've heard amazing testimonies. Sometimes when you at that time where you put your faith in Jesus, he does miraculous things. Like he relieves people of addiction, sometimes right at the moment of faith, right? And burdens of guilt that needed to be forgiven are lifted, right? But nobody is completely free at that moment, right? Because there are other things that God needs to work on in our hearts, all of us, right? And how do we work on those things in our hearts? Is that something that we can just sit back and say, okay, I hate let go and let God, not because there's not some truth to it, but just like God was telling the Israelites, I've given you the land, now you have to go fight the battle. I think he's done the same thing for us. He said, I have broken the power of sin in your life, but now you have to fight the battle. And I will be with you in that battle, and I will give you victory in that battle, but only if you're depending on me. You can't do it any other way. And so I think it's like a parable for us, that God, though he does the giant part of the lifting for us, is still saying there's a part of this that's a battle. I don't know how many battles you've had, spiritual battles you've had to fight, but battles to forgive people that have hurt you, battles to love your difficult people, right? Battles to break free of guilt when Satan keeps coming around and reminding you of sins of the past that Jesus has said is forgiven, but Satan doesn't want to let go of, right? There are battles that we need to fight, temptations, addictions, that pull us away from Jesus and away from God. He's saying, I will give you victory over those things, but you have to learn to lean in me, to trust in me, and then to obey me and to fight that battle to obey, right? It doesn't just happen just like that. And I think he needs all of us to understand both things, right? And I think sometimes Christians only see this first part and they're like, yes, I'm so glad I'm saved and I know I'm going to heaven, and now la 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 la, I don't want to know anything else, right? But Jesus is saying the only way you can have the abundant life is if you get in the yoke with me and follow me. And I will teach you how to overcome those things that you cannot overcome on your own, but I can enable you to overcome. So with that said, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word, for the amazing truth that you reveal in it. And Father, just like you gave Joshua and the Israelites amazing, miraculous victories over enemies that were too strong for them, and you promised to be with them, to never leave them or forsake them. Father, you have done the same for us. You have done this amazing thing. You have released us from the power of sin in our lives, and you have forgiven us for all the crummy things that we have done through the power of Jesus in the sacrifice that he made for us. But now, Father, you want more for us. You didn't just save us so that we could sit here and just be glad in our salvation. You saved us so that we could be a light, a kingdom of priests that would shine to the world because of our love for people, because of our serving others, to have a heart to serve. But Father, we need your help with that because we still have this sin nature that fights against it. And you've promised us victory, but only when we get in the yoke with you. So, Father, I pray for my sisters and for myself that you will help us to fight this battle. Father, where the Holy Spirit convicts us of places in our heart that are not yet surrendered to you, Father, I just pray that in faith and obedience we will say, yes, Lord, we want to do what you want. Where we have maybe been serving a God of our own making, where we're seeing that we were believing in a God that doesn't match what we're reading here in the Bible. Father, and many today are doing that. I pray that you'll convict us, that you'll help us to bring our beliefs in line with what you have revealed to us about yourself. And I pray these things in the mighty and powerful name of our Lord Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right, so keep going. Oh, I just want to give you a little warning about Judges. I always say, don't let your children read Judges before you read Judges. It's a little bit like an R-rated thing, and you will understand that after you get to the end of Judges. It's one of the saddest parts of the history of the Israelites is in the book of Judges. So just beware.
Can I ask something?
Yes.